Now I want to start refreshing your JavaScript knowledge by first exploring this import-export syntax I mentioned before. Because in this course, we're going to import and export a lot of things. Because in React apps, like in most more advanced JavaScript projects, it is considered a best practice to split your code across multiple files to keep it maintainable and manageable. And that's exactly what you do with help of the import and export keywords. Now for that, let's say that in the util.js file, we have a certain value that should be usable in other files as well. For example, in the app.js file. Here we could have an API key variable, and variables in JavaScript are created with the special let keyword, but I'll get back to variables and constants and some key things you should know about them a little bit later in this section. And in there we could store a string created with single or double quotes, doesn't matter. And that string could then contain some cryptic API key that maybe is required in order to send HTTP requests to a backend. This is just a dummy example here, but this overall section will just show you some dummy examples, because in the end it is just about refreshing your JavaScript knowledge. So if that API key, that value here, this string here, should also be available in other files, we need to export it by adding the export keyword in front of it. This makes this thing, this variable here in this case, available outside of this file as well. We can then import it in the file where it should be used, so in this app.js file, for example, by using the import keyword. And then here we need opening and closing curly braces. And between those braces, we then refer to the name of the thing that's exported. So in this case, the name of the variable. If we would be exporting a function, it would be the name of the function instead. But here it's the name of the variable. So API key written like this. And of course, the casing matters because JavaScript is a case-sensitive language. And then thereafter, we need the from keyword to let JavaScript know from which file we're importing this thing named API key. This path to the file then goes between quotes, single or double quotes, again doesn't matter. And here we then typically have a relative path starting with // if it's in the same folder, starting with .. if we want to go up one folder. But here it is in the same folder, so I will use // and then the name of the file with the extension added, at least if you're using just JavaScript. Now, when working in React projects, you will actually see that the extension, the .js, typically is omitted there. That's the case, again, because of that build process that's running behind the scenes, which will add the extension behind the scenes. If you're writing just JavaScript code without such a build process, you do need to add it on your own. But throughout this course, where we do use React projects that come with such a build process that adds the extension for us, we will actually not add it on our own. But here we need to do it. And with that, this API key variable and the value it contains will be available in this app.js file, even though it's defined in another file. And here we could then, for example, console log API key to output it in the console. Now, very important, for these import and export keywords to work, you must be using this type module import here. That's really crucial. Though you will see that for the React projects, if you explore the automatically injected script tags there, you don't find this type module attribute on them. The reason for that simply is that this build process will actually take all your imports and exports and basically merge all these separate files that you have during development into one big file or a bunch of big files, which are then imported with the old school syntax in the right order. This is done to also make this code execute in browsers that don't natively support this import-export syntax, and also so that the browser doesn't have to download dozens of small JavaScript files, but instead just a couple of bigger files, which typically is more efficient. And I'm just letting you know about this here so that you don't wonder why this type module is missing on your React project's script tags. But if you have a vanilla JavaScript app without such a build process, you do need to add this type module attribute here. And with that here in this project, if you save that and reload the app, and you then open this console, you should see your API key being output there. And that's of course coming from the app.js file where we are importing it from the util.js file. Now that's not the only variation of this export-import syntax though. This is one way of exporting and importing things, but in this course you'll also see another way. Besides exporting with help of the export keyword in front of a variable or function, you can also create a so-called default export by adding the default keyword. Now in that case, you must not create a variable thereafter like this, and you also don't assign a name. Instead, you just export the value like this. So now I'm just exporting a value without a name. And when adding the default keyword here, I'm saying that this value here, should be the default thing that's exported by this file. And what's very important is that you must only have one default export per file. If I try to add a second one, I'm getting an error. On the other hand, with the syntax we had before, without default, you can export as many things as you want. Exporting another variable like this wouldn't have been any problem. With the default keyword, you directly export a value and you must only have one default export per file. So I'll also add the old code here, simply so that you see the difference. Like this. And in app.js, the import syntax now also changes if you have a default export. Instead of importing like this, you now import without curly braces. Instead, you just assign any name of your choice. Since the thing that's exported as a default doesn't have a name here, you can use any name you want in the file where you want to import it, but you do need to assign a name. And then you still define the path to the file from which you want to import, like this. With that, if you save this, and again you reload this file, you will see that this again gets logged to the console. Now with help of such a default export and the respective import syntax. And this is also a common way of exporting something and importing something, which is especially useful if you only have one thing, one function, or one value in the file where you want to export it. This is something you will see later in the course once we explore the concept of React components, because there it's quite common that we only have one component, one JavaScript function, as you will learn, per file, and therefore it's quite common to export this one component function as a default, since there are no other things that would be exported in that file. But it is totally up to you which approach you prefer. It's just important to keep in mind that the import syntax also changes if you use the default export syntax here. Now, one last thing you should know about the export and import syntax is that if you have named exports, as this syntax here is called, like this, and let's say you have multiple named exports, for example, you also have another special import syntax you can use. Of course, you can import those named things like this, import API key, for example. I'm just going to comment out this import so that we don't have a name clash. And you could then import all the named things by separating them with a comma here. That's how you would import multiple things from the same file if those things are exported as named exports, so without the default keyword. And as you see here, you can also mix the default keyword with named exports. You just must not have more than one default export. But having a default export in addition to some named exports is absolutely fine. But what you could now do here is that instead of listing all the things you want to import like this as a comma-separated list between the curly braces, you can also import them by grouping them together into a JavaScript object. And that would be done by then using a star, then the as keyword, and then any name of your choice. For example, utils or util, whatever you want. And then again, the path to the file from which you want to import, like this. With that, all the things provided by util.js would be grouped into this object, and therefore you could use it with the default JavaScript object notation, using its name and then the dot notation to access the thing that was named ABC, or the thing that was named API key, or the default export, which is available under a key named default. So that's how you could then output the API key, and therefore here, if I reload, I again see that API key here in the console. Now, by grouping multiple exported things together into one object. As a last side note, this as keyword can also be used to assign aliases. So for example here, if I go back to this named export import thing and I'm not happy with the name ABC here, I could assign an alias by using the as keyword after the thing that I want to rename in this file here. And I could rename it to content or whatever I want. And now if I would console log content here, I would be logging the value that is stored in that ABC variable in the util.js file. But I'm renaming it here in the file where I'm importing it with help of that special as keyword, which allows us to assign an alias to the thing that's being imported. So as you can see, there are a couple of things you can do with this import-export concept. In the end, it is pretty straightforward, but you should know about these keywords and how to use them, because we are going to use them a lot throughout this course.